Hi guys, and we are back with the final chapter of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We are on chapter 17, The Hunting of the White Stag. The battle was all over a few minutes after their arrival. Most of the enemy had been killed in the first charge of Aslan and his companions, and when those who were still living saw that the witch was dead, they either gave themselves up or took to fight. The next thing that Lucy knew was that Peter and Aslan were shaking hands. It was strange to her to see Peter looking as he looked now. His face was so pale and stern, and he seemed to be so much older. "It was all Edmund's doing, Aslan," Peter was saying. "We'd had been beaten if he hadn't been for him. The witch was turning our troops to stone left and right, but nothing would stop him. He fought his way through 3 ogres to where she was, just turning one of your leopards into a statue. And when he reached her, he had a sense to bring his sword smashing down on her wand instead of trying to go for her directly, and simply getting made a statue to himself for his pains. That was all the mistake all the rest were making. Once her wand was broken, we began to finally have a chance. If we hadn't lost so many already, he was terribly wounded. We must go and see him." They found Edmund in charge of Mrs. Beaver a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered with blood, his mouth was open, and his face was a nasty green color. "Quick, Lucy," said Aslan. And then, almost for the first time, Lucy remembered the precious cordial that had been given to her as a present from Father Christmas. Her hands trembled so much that she could hardly open the stopper. But she managed it in the end and poured a few drops into her brother's mouth. "There are the other people wounded," said Aslan, while she was still looking eagerly into Edmund's pale face and wondering if the cordial would have any result. "Yes, I know," said Lucy crossly. "Wait just a minute." "Daughter of Eve," said Aslan in a graver voice, "others are at the point of death. Must more people die for Edmund?" "I'm sorry, Aslan," said Lucy, getting up and going with him, and for the next half hour they were busy, she attending to the wounded while he restored those who had been turned into stone. When at last she was free to come back to Edmund, she found him standing on his feet and not only healed of his wounds, but looking better than she had seen him look for ages. In fact, ever since his first term at that horrible school where they had begun to go wrong. He had become his real self again, and you could look and see the look in his face. And there on the field of battle, Aslan made him a knight. "Does he know," whispered Lucy to Susan, what Aslan did for him? "Does he know what the arrangement with the witch really was?" "Hush! Of course not," said Susan. "Shouldn't he be told?" said Lucy. "Oh, surely not," said Susan. "It would be too awful for him. Think how you'd feel if it were you." "All the same, but I think he ought to know," said Lucy, but at that moment they were interrupted. That night they slept where they were. How Aslan provided food for them all, I don't know, but somehow or other they found themselves all sitting down on the grass to a fine tea at about 8 o'clock. The next day they began marching eastward down the side of the great river, and the next day after that, at about tea time, they actually reached the mouth. The castle of Cair Paravel on its little hill towered up above them. Before them were the sands with rocks and the little pools of salt water and seaweed, and the smell of the sea and long miles of bluish-green waves breaking forever and ever on the beach. And the cry of seagulls. Have you heard it? Do you remember? That evening after tea, the 4 children all managed to get down on the beach again and get their shoes and stockings off and feel the sand between their toes. But the next day was more solemn, for then in the great hall of Cair Paravel, that wonderful hall with the ivory roof and the west wall hung with peacock feathers and the eastern door which looks towards the sea, in the presence of all their friends and to the sound of trumpets, Aslan crowned them and led them to the 4 thrones amid deafening shouts. "Long live King Peter! Long live Queen Susan! Long live King Edmund! Long live Queen Lucy!" Once a king or queen in Narnia, always a king or queen. "Bear it well, sons of Adam, bear it well, daughters of Eve," said Aslan. And through the eastern door, which was wide open, came the voices of the mermen and the mermaids swimming close to the shore and singing in honor of their new kings and queens. So the children sat on their thrones and scepters that were put into their hands, and they gave rewards and honors to all their friends. To Tumnus the fawn, and to the beavers, and to the giant Rumblebuffin, and to the leopards, and the good centaurs, and the good dwarfs, and to the good lion. And that night there was a great feast in Cair Paravel, and revelry and dancing, and gold flashed and wine flowed, and answering to the music inside. But stranger, sweeter, and more piercing came the music of the sea people. But amid all these rejoicings, Aslan himself quietly slipped away. And when the kings and queens noticed that he wasn't there, they said nothing about it. For Mr. Beaver had warned them. "He will be coming and going," he had said. "One day you'll see him, and another day you won't. He doesn't like being tied down, and of course he has other countries to attend to. It's quite all right. He'll often drop in. Only you mustn't force him. He is a wild lion, you know, not a tame lion." And now, as you see, this story is nearly, but not quite, to an end. These 2 kings and 2 queens governed Narnia well, and long and happy was their reign. At first, much of their time was spent in seeking out the remnants of the White Witch's army and destroying them. And indeed, for a long time, there would be news of evil things lurking in the wilder parts of the forest. A haunting here, a killing there, a glimpse of werewolves one month, and a rumor of a hag the next. But in the end, all that foul brood was stamped out. And they made good laws and kept the peace and saved the good trees from being unnecessarily cut down. They liberated young dwarfs and young satyrs from being sent to school, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers, and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live. They drove back fierce giants, the opposite of Mr. Rumblebuffin, on the north of Narnia. With these ventured across the frontier, and they entered into friendship and alliance with countries beyond the sea, and paid them visits of state and received visits of state from them. And they themselves grew and changed as the years passed by. Peter became a tall, deep-chested man and a great warrior, and he was called King Peter the Magnificent. Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman with black hair that fell almost to her feet, and the kings of the countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors asking for her hand in marriage, and she was called Susan the Gentle. Edmund was a graver and quieter man than Peter, and great in counsel and judgment. He was called King Edmund the Just. But as for Lucy, she was always happy and golden-haired, and all princes in those parts desired to be her queen. And in her own people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. So they lived in great joy, and if ever there be remembered their life in this world, it was only as one remembers a dream. And one year it fell out that Tumnus, who was a middle-aged fawn by now, beginning to be stout, came down river and brought them the news that the white stag had once more appeared in his parts, the white stag who would give you wishes if you caught him. So these 2 kings and 2 queens, with the principal members of their court, rode a-hunting with horns and hounds in the western woods to follow the white stag, and they had not hunted long before they had a sight of him. And he led them through a thick pace over rough and smooth, and through thick and thin, till the horses of all the courtiers were tired out, and only these 4 were still following. And they saw a stag enter into a thicket where the horses could not follow. Then said King Peter, for they talked in a quite different style now, having been kings and queens for so many years, "Fair consorts, let us now alight from our horses and follow this beast into the thicket, for in all my days I never hunted a nobler quarry." "Sir," said the others, "even so let us do." So they got off their horses and tied them to trees and went on to foot into the thick woods. And as soon as they had entered it, Queen Susan said, "Fair friends, here is a great marvel, for I seem to see a tree of iron." "Madam," said King Edmund, If you look well upon it, you shall see it is a pillar of iron with a lantern set on top. By the lion's mane, a strange device, said King Peter, to set a lantern here where the trees cluster so thick about it and so high above it that if it were lit, it should give light to no man. Sir, said Queen Lucy, by likelihood when this post and this lamp were set here, there were no smaller trees in this place. For this is a young wood, and the iron post is old. And they stood looking upon it. Then said King Edmund, I know not how it is, but this lamp post worketh upon me strangely. It runs in my mind like I might have seen it before, as if it were in a dream, or in the dream of a dream. Sir, answered them all, we feel the same. And more, said Queen Lucy, for it will not go out of my mind that if we pass this post and lantern, either we shall find strange adventures, or else some great changes of our fortunes. Madam, said King Edmund, the like forebodeth stirreth in my heart also. And in mine, fair brother, said King Peter. Mine too, said Queen Susan. Wherefore, by my counsel, we shall lightly return to our horses and follow this white stag no further. Madam, said King Peter, therein I pray thee to have me excused, for never since the four of us were kings and queens in Narnia have we set our hands to any high matter, as battles, quests, feats, arms of justice, and the like, and then given over. But always what we have taken in hand, the same we have always achieved. Sister, said Queen Lucy, my royal brother speaks right. We have never given up, and it would be a shame if we turned back from following a noble beast as we now have been in a chase. And so say I, said King Edmund. I have such desire to find the significance of this thing that I would not be my good to turn back for the richest jewel in all of Narnia and the islands. So these king and queens entered into the thicket, and a thicket means the woods. They entered into the woods, and before they had gone a score of paces, they all remembered the thing that they had seen was called a lamp post. And before they had gone 20 more steps, they noticed that they were making their way not through branches, but through coats. And the next moment, they all came tumbling out of a wardrobe door into an empty room. And they were no longer kings and queens in their hunting gowns, but just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy in their old kid clothes. It was the same day and the same hour of the day on which they had all gone into the wardrobe to hide. Mrs. McReady and the visitors were still talking in the passage, but luckily they never came into the empty room, and so the children weren't caught. And that would have been the very end of the story if it hadn't been that they felt they really must explain to the professor why the four of his coats out of his wardrobe were missing. And the professor, who was a very remarkable man, didn't tell them not to be silly or not to tell lies, but he believed the whole story. No, he said, I don't think it will be any good trying to go back through the wardrobe door to get the coats. You won't get into Narnia again by that route, nor would the coats be much of use by now if you did. What's this? Yes, of course you'll get back into Narnia again someday. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. But don't go trying to use the same route twice. Indeed, don't try to get there at all. It'll happen when you're not even thinking or looking for it. And don't talk too much about it, even among yourselves. And don't mention it to anyone else unless you find them that they've had adventures in the same sort and don't mention it to anyone else unless you find that they've had adventures of the same kind themselves. What's that? How will you know? Oh, you'll know all right. Odd things they say, even their looks, will let the secret out. Keep your eyes open. Bless me, what do they even teach you at these schools? And that is the very end of the adventure of the wardrobe. But if the professor was right, it was only the beginning of the adventures of Narnia. And that is the end of the book. Okay, so in that chapter, they became kings and queens of Narnia. They won the battle against the witch, of course. They turned all the statues back into living animals or people. They became the kings and queens, and Aslan left, and Mr. Beaver said he comes and goes, and he has other countries to take care of. So they said many, many years later, they had been there for years. They decided Mr. Tumnus saw a white stag, which was like an enemy in Narnia, and they went hunting for it. And then they saw the lampposts that they barely remembered from the very, very beginning of the book, but it had been years that they had been in Narnia. So when they saw that lamppost, they were intrigued by it, and they said, never mind about that enemy we were chasing. Let's go to the woods behind this lamppost, because it feels like we've had a dream about it. And so when they went into the woods, of course, they went through the wardrobe. They started going through coats, and then they fell out of the wardrobe, and they were right back as kids again, because when time passes in Narnia, no time passes in the regular world. And they told the professor about it, and they said, don't talk to anyone about it. Don't talk to yourselves about it. When it's time to go to Narnia again, it will happen. And that's the end of the book. So I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. You can send me a message on Dojo. And that's all.